Laura Debenham. Thank you, Laura, for joining us today. We have enabled closed captioning for this talk. To access this function, please select the live transcript / closed captioning button at the bottom of your screen. Click on the arrow. Click on the arrow on the top left of the live transcript button to hide or show the transcription. Just so you're aware, this session is being recorded and will be available on the Diversity and Inclusion website later on this spring. We will provide a link in the chat box to our assessment evaluation at the very end, and I know the Diversity and Inclusion team would greatly appreciate your feedback. So with all that housekeeping out of the way, I will turn it over to our speaker.
Thanks, Aubrey. Thanks for all your hard work. Appreciate it. Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name's Laura Debenham. I'm the director of the 3+1 social work program through Great Basin College. For those of you not familiar with this program, what my students do is they study their first 3 years at Great Basin College, which has campuses all over rural Nevada, and they do their last year at UNR. And this is an incredibly wonderful program. It's we try to be really empowering with the students. And of course, the goal is to get social workers all over rural Nevada. So that's my main qualification for my professional credential. But I'm going to talk to you today. I'm going to try to be fairly vulnerable and open up and share a lot of things with you because this is such an important topic. I've given this presentation or a version of it to community education classes. And it's really interesting how much in demand this topic is. All of us in a post-pandemic world are dealing with anxiety, depression, and grief constantly. And so we're going to talk about all three of those topics. Oh, if I can know how to, there we go. I'm going to quote Brene Brown a lot. She talks about how the dark does not destroy the light, it defines it. It's our fear of the dark that casts our joy into the shadows. I love that. I love Brene Brown. So empowering. She talks about how if you trade your authenticity for safety, you may experience the following: anxiety, depression, eating disorders, addiction, rage, blame, resentment, and inexplicable grief. If we can share our story with someone who responds with empathy and understanding, then shame cannot survive. I love that. So let's start out with talking about dealing with anxiety. So my credential of being a director of a college program is not anywhere near as demanding as my role of being a Grammy. And one of the things I love about being a Grammy, and I've been a social worker, I've played a lot of different roles in the social work world. I've done clinical work, one-on-one therapy, group therapy, court-ordered domestic violence and parenting classes, family advocacy, all that kind of thing. I've also been a school social worker, and that was an incredibly interesting, phenomenal experience. And I know a lot of you work with children or have children in your life. And isn't it interesting, as we get older, we observe ourselves as we learn and grow and experience. And we're fascinated by children because we were once there. And being vulnerable really creates anxiety, doesn't it? And kids are just vulnerable. They're striving for independence most of the time. Which is why they have a hard time with the word no, right? But I feel like if we can sit back and observe the children in our life, we really can learn how to deal with our own anxiety because they teach us so much. I loved how Carrie Murphy in her presentation this morning talked about how having a dog helps her set boundaries in her life. And do children do that as well? Absolutely. Anybody else that we have to take care of helps us forget ourselves and focus on something outside of us. So I'm going to share some stories with you about experiences I've had with children. And okay, are children good at regulating their emotion? Yeah, not really, right? when I was teaching court-ordered parenting classes, the number one take home for me was always meet the child where they are, right? Attempt to see the world from their lens, from their perspective, and keep our emotions regulated. So we would never hand the remote control to someone else in our life, especially a child. You know that term, they push my buttons? Kids do that, don't they? They push our buttons. And so you're not going to hand a child a remote control to your emotions. We're going to keep smooth and calm while they're all over the place. So, going to tell you a story. Gianna's 4 years old, and over spring break, we went to a wedding, and it was decided that Grammy and Gianna would fly, and some more grown-up members of the family would drive from Vegas to Phoenix, okay? So I also had my little dog with me. So I had a little dog and a little girl, and I'm getting on an airplane, all right? Going through all the stuff you have to go through. And of course, I'm a social worker, I'm an empath, I'm a caregiver, I'm a caretaker. And so, I didn't think it was that big of a deal to have a little dog and a little girl. Since then, I've had a lot of people in my life say, what were you thinking? I was just thinking, you fly, you take your little cohort with you. So as we were going through security, and let me tell you, Gianna is one of those little individuals, not really good at emotional regulation. She tends to have tummy troubles at the most inopportune times. If Grampy's driving too fast, she lets him know. She's, Grampy, I got a tummy ache. And that means slow down, Grampy. If Daddy comes home from work a little grumpy, and Daddy's a nurse, he has a high demand job, she lets him know her tummy hurts. And that means, hey, chill out. I'm dealing with stuff here. So as we're going through the airport security, and, I showed all of the paperwork that showed that I was Gianna's guardian and that she was with me and all that stuff, and my license, and we get through the first part, and the woman who looked over all of that material said, okay, and Gianna, you don't have to take your shoes off. And okay then. Now, from Gianna's perspective, what did that mean? From my perspective, it's like, man, I have to take my shoes off, but children don't have to take their shoes off. Lucky kids. Gianna's perspective was, what? All the grown-ups are taking their shoes off. And she said, Grammy, I want to take my shoes off. And she started to have a tier 3 meltdown, okay? So she started to melt down, and I reversed from Grammy mode to mommy mode, back to those days when it was, okay, do you need a timeout? And starting to count to 1, 2, 3 and all that kind of thing, not giving her everything she wants. And she was confused and I was stressed. And as we went through security, she continued to melt down. It got worse and worse and worse. And I said, Gianna, okay, here, have a lollipop. Let's get through this. When we finally got through security, got the dog out, got everything back in, I sat her on my lap and I took her little shoes off and I waved her little sweaty feet in the air and I put her shoes back on, and then she was fine. Crazy. I thought about that a lot since then, and I thought about the anxiety in my own life and how sometimes my anxiety comes from my lens, from my perspective. If I perceive something as not fair, it's less fair, right? If I perceive that as an unfair situation, then I'm going to have a harder time with it. If I perceive it as a privileged situation, I'm going to have a whole different point of view. And I don't know, I've thought a lot about that. We have some really wonderful staff at Great Basin College, and the director of the preschool program is here with us today, Emily Bailey. And she was sharing a story with me the other day about creating a behavior plan for a little boy that was struggling at the preschool. And she talked about how creating a plan for this guy included an activity of blowing pinwheels. So getting the kid to take a deep breath and then blow a pinwheel. What does this do for the child? It regulates him from the inside out, right? It gives him, infuses his system with oxygen. So he's infusing his frontal lobe, that, I mean, he's only 3, so that's not that developed yet, but he's able to work from the frontal lobe rather than the amygdala. And very, very empowering. I told Emily she needed to create a behavior plan for Will Smith. That would be a good idea. Another wonderful employee at Great Basin College is my colleague, Oscar Sita. And he once shared with me that anxiety is part of the human experience. Brene Brown said, we're emotional beings who occasionally think. I shared this idea with my husband, and he said, well, I think that's true for women, but I think men are thinking beings who occasionally emote. And I thought he was probably correct about that. And that's a fair perspective because that's the lens that he sees his world from. But I really like that saying, we're emotional beings who occasionally think. That definitely holds true for me. So Oscar and I share some responsibilities. He's the director of the Human Services Program at Great Basin College. And I'm the chair of the A&P committee. So Oscar and I and several nursing professors sit down every week with nursing students who are struggling. They've had a couple of unsatisfactory scores. And so according to their bylaws, they need to meet with a group of professors and they need to present a plan for how they are going to succeed as a nursing student. So the other day, we are in one of these meetings, and sometimes our nursing students get a little emotional. We don't mean these meetings to be punitive in nature, but sometimes it comes across that way because they're meeting with, what they perceive as people with authority over them. And I can understand why it would be scary, even though we try to be as nurturing and as empowering as possible. So, a nursing student broke down and she started to weep. And, even an experienced social worker wasn't sure how to handle this situation. I know how to handle a situation like that in a therapeutic environment, but this is an academic environment. And I loved watching Oscar. Oscar said, anxiety's asking something from you. What is it asking? Remember to see these emotions for what they are. I loved that statement. And I've used that statement a lot since hearing Oscar say it because we all have primary emotions and secondary emotions. Our secondary emotions are often covering up what we're really feeling, what that real vulnerable emotion is. So anger is a secondary emotion. It gives us a false sense of power. And so thinking about what these emotions are, if you're grieving a loss, acknowledge it. This student was grieving a loss. She didn't do well on a few tests. And so there was a fear associated with that. Acknowledging them gives you more power to diffuse them. And the other thing Oscar said is you can heal through being heard and understood. That's why therapy works. That's why we share our stories. That's why we allow ourselves to be vulnerable so that we can heal through being heard and understood. And the more we share our own stories, the more we're able to heal from them. Oscar also said, seek out the sources you need to release your anxiety. I loved this. So if you're a nursing student, there's obviously not a lack of commitment on your part, but there's possibly some negative self-talk that can be overwhelming when you take an exam. So remember that part of your training is developing your faculties so that nothing rattles you. So if that applies to a nursing student, that applies to all of us. We're training to develop our faculties so that nothing rattles us, so that we keep our calm. I tell my 300 level students who are taking my professional social worker course that a professional is someone who is not rattled. A professional is someone who can keep their calm in crisis. So if you are the student that's giving the president of your college her COVID shot, you are going to trust in the training that you had, and you're going to know that you can do that job. So, Oscar went on to share a story with this student that was incredibly empowering. He told her how he was on the track team when he was in high school. And he said the track team wore their sweats during practice. And he said as they practiced in their sweatsuits, that clothing seemed to get heavier and heavier and heavier. And he said, you know, when you take a test, it's like taking off your sweats and running in your shorts. You're free, but you also have carried something heavy with you for a while, and you're able to let go of it and run and be free. So the same holds true with sitting in our own darkness so we can understand the dark others sit in. When we're able to take a look at our own lives and deconstruct and understand our own experiences, we're better able to have empathy for others. So like the body, the mind has the capacity to heal itself. We do things like those deep breathing exercises that Emily talked about with a pinwheel. We might do it with, when I was teaching court-ordered domestic violence anger management classes, one of the things that I taught my clients was to imagine holding a birthday cake and blowing out the candles, taking in a deep breath for 7 counts, and then blowing out for 4. And what that does, again, is infuses the frontal lobe with oxygen so that you can think with the logic that's there. Some of those physiological responses to anxiety include sweaty palms, gripping your hands, tensing your shoulders, and taking a deep breath and consciously remembering to, put your shoulders down, unclench your hands, be in the moment, helps us get through anxiety. I loved this little meme here. I will get through this like I do every time. Take deep breaths. I'm loved, safe, and protected. This will soon pass and I will feel happy again. This is not forever or constant, and I am not my anxiety. I have another little granddaughter, and Goldie's only 2. So her developmental job is striving for independence, right? And I often say to her, you are kind, you are smart, and you are important. And I know a lot of you know the movie that's from and the book. And Goldie will repeat that back to me. She's pretty smart for a 2-year-old and very articulate. And sometimes she adamantly refuses to, because she wants to feel her independence. And you know what? That is okay. And she doesn't have to be anything she doesn't want to be, including kind, smart, and important. Okay, let's talk about dealing with depression. Anxiety and depression are often different sides of the same coin, right? So they often go hand in hand. It's really interesting if you study pharmacology at all, you recognize that a lot of the times we will use the same prescription, but we'll double the dose for depression. So that we'll use like Zoloft, a psychiatrist or medical doctor or nurse practitioner or whatever will prescribe 50 milligrams for anxiety and 100 milligrams for depression. So I think that's interesting to help us better understand how they can be so close to each other. Glennon Doyle is a wonderful individual who has struggled with anxiety and depression and written about it. And one of the things she said is being human is not about feeling happy, but about feeling everything. I loved what was said in our opening presentation this morning by Shadi, how she talked about using rage as the compost for your garden. Turn righteous rage into love. And, if you study anger, if you study the components of anger, that righteous anger is really deeply seated in care, concern, fear for someone you care about. One of the things that I would say in parenting classes all the time is teenagers and 2-year-olds are striving for independence. And so a lot of the time parents are struggling with that. They have a hard time accepting their child being independent. And instead of giving them boundaries that are flexible and that can grow and allow that person to become an individual, to remember that we're raising people, we're raising adults, not children. They're not going to stay kids forever. And so what we do is we loosen up those boundaries as we go. And this is so, so important. And a lot of parents that I've worked with have really struggled with this concept. And they end up showing a surface emotion or a secondary emotion of anger toward their 2-year-old or their teenager. Because if they're independent, I mean, they come into this world as this super dependent little creature, right? And so those boundaries that we start out with are a tiny little box-shaped crib. And those boundaries are really solid and they're really important. We got to keep that kid safe. We don't want them rolling off or, anyway, so we have really solid boundaries that we start out. But as they get older and as we start to trust that they can make some of their own decisions, and then they get into those teenage years and they want the keys to the car, and you recognize they could die out there. It's really scary. It's scary to be a parent. It's scary to be a caregiver. And so that primary emotion of fear gets covered up by this secondary emotion of anger. So if we can look at the primary emotion and validate that in ourselves and others, we can go a long way toward connecting and diffusing some of the frustration in our lives. Okay, raise your hand if you are a fan of Winnie the Pooh and all those characters. I want to share something awesome with you. I didn't include this in my slide presentation, but this is the disorders of characters in Winnie the Pooh. So all the DSM-5 diagnoses, all right? Piglet has anxiety or generalized anxiety disorder. He's always nervous or scared. He stutters because he could have experienced an incident where his self-esteem was weakened. Yeah? Do you ever feel like Piglet? I know I do. Eeyore. Eeyore. Okay, some websites say Eeyore has dysthymia. Others say major depressive disorder. So, yeah, but we all agree Eeyore's depressed. He's always sad. Owl has dyslexia and short-term memory loss because he often misspells and misreads words. He forgets things after he says them, and he has trouble recalling information. Tigger has ADHD, obviously, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Now, there are some experts who believe Tigger also is bipolar. He can't sit still, and he rapidly switches moods. Okay? You guys know a Tigger in your life? Rabbit has OCD. He's obsessively compulsive. He's extremely orderly. Kanga has social anxiety disorder. She's extremely overprotective of Roo. And Roo has autism spectrum disorder because he lacks awareness of danger, has a strange attachment of sitting in his mother's pouch. And then, of course, Christopher Robin is schizophrenic because his friends appear depending on his mood. Anyway, yeah. Interesting stuff. How many of you have ever been depressed and had a Tigger in your life? Or maybe you've been the Tigger. I had an experience years ago. My appendix ruptured and I was living in Alaska at the time. I was in the hospital. I became septic and was in the ICU for 2 weeks. They weren't sure I was going to make it. It was a really scary time. And finally I came out of it. They gave me, intravenous antibiotics and I was able to recover. But it was a very interesting experience. It was a really scary experience. And my cousin came to visit me. My cousin has been a dear friend for most of my married life. She's technically my husband's cousin, but she came into the hospital and she is a cancer survivor. She had just found out that one of her dear friends who she met getting chemo together had passed away from her cancer. So I had recovered and my dear friend and cousin's dear friend had not. And so Debbie and I sat in the hospital and, we were grieving together. And in came the hospital clown. And it was a woman about our age who was dressed like a clown, and she had been hired or she volunteered for the hospital to come in and cheer up hospital patients. The idea was all well and good, but why do you think it didn't work really well? We had just found out this news. And so this individual, while she was well-meaning, she wasn't validating where we were in our emotional state. She wasn't meeting us where we were. And so it ended up, we just said, this isn't a good time. Now, once we said that, once we explained the situation, she apologized and immediately went to cheer up little kids on the next floor. But it was a very interesting experience, and I often share that experience with my students to help illustrate the importance of validating emotions in others and validating them in ourselves. And isn't it cool how the Winnie the Pooh crowd, they're very validating, they're very understanding of Eeyore, and they're not dismissive of what's going on with him. So this last Halloween, my four grandkids from my oldest son, I bought their Halloween costumes, and guess what I dressed them as? Yep, all the Winnie the Pooh characters. They were so cute. I should have included that picture on here. But we all have many of these. One of the other things I think is important to mention about the DSM-5 in talking about anxiety, depression, and all these other disorderly things that we talk about. I think it's important to note that the DSM-5 has given professionals boxes in which to put people. Do people fit in boxes? Very rarely. But we categorize them. And it is very rare that you will find someone who has every single attribute in the DSM-5 under a specific disorder, mental illness, whatever you want to call it. So I think it's important to remember that we are people, and we're not a box. And so in dealing with these issues with ourselves and with others, we need to remember that. So, time for your presenter to be a little vulnerable here. So, I am the little girl on the far left or right. Anyway, the one on the end. The one in the middle is my little sister. The little boy is my little brother. And when we were growing up, I was the boss of these people. I was in charge. Okay, these were my people. This was my tribe. And I was in charge of everything they did. If I said it, they did it. They knew that this was the pattern. This was the hierarchy of control. And I was in command. Yeah. As we grew and developed, they started to kind of, say, no, I'm my own person. I can do my own stuff. It was very confusing for me. I wanted to be the big boss. But I recognized when it was time to step back. And I just love these people so much. They're incredible people in my life. My brother Ren was adopted, and he was an incredible person. He was an ADHD Tigger-like athlete in a family of dysthymic drama nerds, okay? Intellects. But he was an athletic ADHD, so it was very challenging for him. Like I said, he was adopted, and so genetically, he didn't fit with the rest of us. But he was my brother, and I loved him, and we had so much fun together. I watched him deteriorate as we got older and fall into a pattern of substance abuse that was really scary. Often with depression comes substance abuse. We know that. We see that in all the studies across the board. When we have an increase in stress, an increase in depression, we often have an increase in substance abuse issues. And of course, with the pandemic, we have seen those numbers go off the charts. If you're a child of the 80s like me, you are familiar with this scene. This was from the Never-Ending Story. The horse got stuck in the pit of despair, and the little boy tried to rescue him. And I think a lot of us feel this way in dealing with someone we care about who has depression. You know, we just want to pull. We want to do everything in our power to save this person. And sometimes that's not possible. As I thought about this scene as I was preparing this presentation, and I found website after website that said that the horse, in the making of this movie, for the 80s crowd here, in the making of this movie, the horse died. Anyway, several websites said that. I finally found one that debunked that and said that that was not true, that the horse did not die in the making of the movie. Somebody made that up, and that was a relief because it was traumatic enough. Everybody who watched this movie had PTSD as a child. But it was such a visual and such a great way to understand when someone is dealing with depression. It's not sadness. It's not just sorrow. It's something that we feel in our very bones. And I remember my very first abnormal psychology textbook. On the very front page, and this was years ago, I don't think I even own that book anymore, but on the very opening paragraph, there was a statement about, okay, so if you stood a person upright and you started stacking bricks on their shoulders, and you kept stacking bricks and you kept stacking bricks, what would happen to that person eventually? They would collapse. Okay? So emotional stress is like those metaphorical bricks that happen when we have a lot of stress in our life. So we've had pandemic, we've had substance abuse issues. A lot of us have what we used to call broken homes, right? A lot of us deal with social or maybe relationship situations. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but that's that pit of despair. I feel like this scene in this movie describes depression in a way nothing else I've seen has. Glennon Doyle talked about the depression and anxiety she experienced in her book, Untamed. She said, depression and anxiety are not feelings. Feelings return me to myself. Depression and anxiety are body snatchers that suck me out of myself so that I appear to be there, but I'm really gone. Other people can still see me, but no one can feel me anymore, including me. Have you seen that commercial for an antidepressant where they have a mask in front of their face? Yeah, that's what she's talking about. For me, the tragedy of mental illness is not that I'm sad, but that I'm not anything. See, that's the problem with putting people in boxes. It objectifies them, doesn't it? Mental illness makes me miss my own life. I wish that we could get rid of the stigma of mental illness. And one of the assignments that my students do every semester is an evaluation of how the media treats mental illness. So think about the last time you saw mental illness in the media. Was it a positive thing? If you think about the movie Joker, there's a lot of movies out there that kind of glamorize and demonize someone with a mental illness. The people I know with dissociative identity disorder are not monsters. They are brilliant individuals who have figured out a coping mechanism to deal with horrific memories. And because of their high intellect, they're able to literally take themselves out of their own bodies, dissociate. All of us dissociate a little bit, right? Some of you are probably nodding off listening to me right now and dissociating, thinking about something else. That's okay. We all dissociate. When you get to the point that we used to call dissociative identity disorder, multiple personality disorder. So when you get to the point that you're literally beside yourself, that is when you fit in that proverbial box. But do you? Are you an object? No. You are a brilliant individual that came up with a clever coping mechanism that works. Let's talk about dealing with grief. So some people are diagnosed with depression because of a grief episode. A lot of the times grief will bring on a long-term depression. I have permission to share this story. My good family friend, Hayden, passed away, died of suicide about 5 years ago. And the scary and sad thing, I know that many of you have dealt with the loss of a loved one from suicide. And it is epidemic right now, especially among young people. In the last 10 years, I have lost 7 young men who are not just acquaintances, but close family friends or family members to suicide. So grief is something that's very real. It's almost tangible in our culture right now, and we need to deal with this. I love that the Board of Social Workers in Nevada are requiring social workers to take the suicide prevention training annually. It used to be every other year, now it's every year. And I think that's so important. And so that's part of what I want to talk about here as we finish up. I mentioned my brother Ren earlier, and this is where I get really vulnerable. My brother Ren was always at my side. He was, we were very close. And I think partly because there were often times, even though I wasn't adopted like he was, I often felt like I didn't fit in our family. And I know he felt like that sometimes. And so we had a shared camaraderie, and I just loved him so much. In 2010, he was 43 years old, and he died from suicide. And it was one of the most devastating experiences of my life. Up to that point, we had lost our parents. They had both passed away from car accident and cancer. And so we had already dealt with that grief. And I had had friends who had lost a loved one to suicide. And I often said to myself, that would be the worst. I don't know what I would do if that happened. And then it happened. And it was incredibly devastating. Ren was the father of 3 beautiful girls. The youngest was 4 years old. The oldest was 11. It was a loss that devastated me. There are other losses that we deal with all the time. We deal with loss almost daily. Right now, post-pandemic, we're dealing with the loss of a world that once was, aren't we? I don't know. I'm dealing with loss of a bank account because of gas prices. Loss can be physically weighing on us and make us feel incapable to be and be the person we were, do the things that we did. You're all familiar with the 5 steps of grief, the 5 different phases of grief by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. I give my students the acronym DABDA. We call it DABDA: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Most of us are really good at anger. Why? Again, it's that secondary emotion that gives us a false sense of power, Denial, it's not as vulnerable. But we start out, when I lost my brother, at first I was like, no, that couldn't have happened. Then why did this happen? I was so angry. Then the bargaining. What could I have done different? If I would have said something. The last text I sent him was, "I love you." And it was a few days before the event. So, and then the depression sets in, and sometimes that can last a long time. And finally, the acceptance. These 5 stages are not fluid. They're not like stair steps, okay? If they were, then for me, there was the first step, and then there was the anger step. Really good at that one. Why? Because it gave me a false sense of control. But these are fluid, and I just think it's really helpful to remember that step of anger. It's strength, and it can be an anchor, giving temporary structure to the nothingness of loss. The Gottman Institute, I love John Gottman. I am such a huge fan of his work. And he talks about how, although anger is a valid emotion on its own, remember that it can also indicate other emotions that need to be addressed or validated. Oftentimes, when we're experiencing anger, we need to look underneath to see what need is not being met in ourselves and in others. I love Shakespeare's quote, "Everyone can master a grief, but he who has it." A lot of us, when we were dealing with a loss, will get all kinds of advice from people around us telling us, what they did. When my mother was hit by a car and in a coma for a week, and we had to choose to take her off life support, one of my friends said to me, "Well, I lost my mom when I was 8 years old. You had yours for 27 years. You should be grateful." I didn't feel grateful, and I didn't feel validated by that. And sometimes people teach you what not to say. In 2005, I was in St. George, Utah, visiting my sister and brother-in-law who live up on a hill overlooking the river. We found there was a flood happening at this time. Now, this was shortly after the death of my father, who died from cancer. And so I was dealing with the grief of losing my father. As I looked down on this river, I watched the flood literally take out homes. I watched the river grow, and it would bend and it would take out a house. And it was so crazy. These are homes that had been there for 20 years. But the river came along, and I thought, that river is like my grief. And I wrote this: grief is a river, it ebbs and it flows. I can't control the direction it goes. Yeah. If you've experienced it, you know what I'm talking about. There will be times, even today, when suddenly I will see a woman in the grocery store who reminds me of my mother. And I lost my mother 30 years ago, but I will have this memory hit me, and it's like that river, a flash flood of a river just slamming into me. Sometimes it feels more like a tsunami. So if you know what I'm talking about, that tsunami of grief can be incredibly overwhelming. If you are dealing with a loved one's grief and you're trying to help them, just recognizing that imagery might help, that it feels like a tsunami you're being slammed into. And if you're validated, it's going to go much further than trying to fix that person, trying to pull them out of the mud. Validate where they are. That's got to be so hard. Tell me about the person you lost. Tell me stories about them. Learning statements and using statements like, "That must be so frustrating. That must be scary." Just statements of validation can be incredibly helpful. Some of the loss we experience include illness and pain, social changes, addictions, moving, change of status. For those of you who are students, it's homework, feeling overwhelmed. Sometimes for those of us who are professors, it's homework and feeling overwhelmed. Discord in our relationships. Little is discussed about children who deal with their parents breaking up, and that can be very challenging for the kids. There are secondary losses that can be as difficult as the primary losses. So the parent's divorce is the primary loss, but the secondary loss, the parent's divorce, here's a good metaphor for you. The parent's divorce is getting the rug pulled out from under you. But if it results in a move where you lose all your friends and you lose the school you went to, you lose where you went to the doctor and the grocery store, it can be more like feeling the whole ground has turned to quicksand. And that can actually be more of a loss to a child than the absence of a parent. So acknowledging that with kids, validating that with them. This is really hard. This is really tough. I get it. Having us divorced was like having the rug pulled out. But then moving across the country was like your whole world turning to quicksand. Or whatever metaphor works for you. Some other losses we experience can be childhood abuse. A lot of my students will have memories surface. A lot of them are young people, and they'll have memories surface as we research and study abuse. And that can be incredibly overwhelming. LGBTQI issues can be another sense of loss in a society that doesn't always acknowledge how challenging it can be. Finding out you're on the autism spectrum or someone you love is can feel like a sense of loss, and education can help you better understand that. Living single when you thought you'd be connected with a significant other. Financial stress, family, parents, siblings, disabilities, any kind of betrayal. All of these are loss that we deal with, and sometimes they lead to emotional grief. With that comes shock, anger, guilt, anxiety, sadness, and loneliness. Again, when you're trying to help someone else through this, validating where they are can be incredibly helpful. If it's you that's dealing with emotional grief, share feelings. Find a safe place, whether it's family, friends, teacher, a counselor, or a support group. I love Al-Anon. When my brother passed away, I embraced Al-Anon. He had been part of his suicide had to do with substance abuse. And so if you have a loved one who has a substance abuse issue, you qualify for Al-Anon. I believe Al-Anon and AA and Alateen are some of the best kept secrets in the world of mental health. You know, they expect you to bring $1 to put into the basket that's passed around, and you sit there for an hour and you talk about your feelings, you listen to other people talk about where they're coming from, and you learn tools, you learn skills that help you recognize, in Al-Anon specifically, that it's not your job to fix other people. A lot of us who qualify for Al-Anon are people who are the fixers. We're the empaths. We're those who are the caregivers. And so sometimes that means we're the enablers. We're empowerers too, but we have to look inside ourselves and recognize how some of these behaviors can be addicting, just like those substances can be addicting. The heady feeling of control can be a very addictive situation. So there's 12 steps for us too to deal with that. And there's sayings that become tools that we have in our backpack, like detach with love, separate yourself from that individual. There is a higher power and it's not you. When you allow someone else to have a higher power, then you're not it anymore. And if you try to be their higher power, you get in the way of their relationship with their higher power. Feeling can be healing. Like my buddy Oscar said, if you can feel it, you can heal from it. So some of the physical symptoms that come from this emotional grief include a loss of appetite or an increase in appetite, a lack of sleep or too much sleep, weight fluctuations, heart palpitations, headaches, restlessness, muscle twitching. We need to remember to balance our work, sleep, and recreation, 8 hours a day of each. Remember that if you're working all the time, your life's going to start to be really dull. And so what if you're a graduate student and you feel like you need to work 16 hours a day? Is there a way that you can turn 8 hours of that into play? A study was done years ago on hotel maids, and the control group was not told anything. The other group was told that they were getting a workout by changing bed sheets, cleaning toilets, running up and down stairs. They were getting a workout. That group of individuals lost weight. All of their lab work came back better after several weeks of doing their regular work. And what changed? Their thought process. They were thinking, oh, I'm getting a workout while I do this. So one of the things I tell my students every day is think of your higher education as your me time. Write those papers. Have fun writing those papers. Find joy in what you do. And you'll never work a day in your life, right? Make sure you're having social interaction. We often, when we experience loss, we feel wounded and vulnerable. We might withdraw and isolate. We might feel a loss of identity. So push yourselves to be with and to serve others. This is a picture that was taken a couple years before my brother passed away. And yesterday, his first grandchild was born. And it's incredibly healing for all of us that loved Ren, because life goes on and there's always hope. There is always hope. So look for it where you can find it, and you'll be amazed. When you're looking around and recognizing that there are people that you care about who may be contemplating suicide, and it's hard to understand why they would feel that way, it's important to recognize that when we're helping them, they often feel isolated, they feel alone, they feel that nobody will understand what they're dealing with. They're unable to see any other way of dealing with the pain. And it seems like that suicide's the only option. Here's some of the signs to watch out for. They may become outwardly calm when before they were kind of angsty. Be aware that this could mean that they've made a quiet resolution to complete a suicide plan. So at that point is when we start asking questions. The important thing to remember is that if someone is not their usual self, or if they're showing signs that arouse your concern, you need to check it out. We all need to step up and be the people who question, be the people who say those validating statements, those questioning statements. Are you okay? Are you okay? Is there anything I can do to help? Can we talk? People undergoing stress, those bricks that are weighing them down. A lot of times it's life changes. Missed job promotions, mental illness, failed exams, relationship breakdown. This can be for children as well. So as behavior changes, be sure to take a look. Be sure to be someone who steps in and makes a difference. In a world where people tell you to calm down, no one has ever calmed down when they were told to calm down. Did they calm down when someone said, "Are you okay?" Probably. More likely, when a validating statement is made, they'll calm down than if they're told to calm down. So make sure you're using healthy coping strategies, seeking support. Begin the journey to healing and acceptance. Brene Brown said, compassion is knowing our darkness enough so that we can sit in the dark with others. And I want to challenge all of you to do that. Know your own darkness. Do the work that you need to do to take care of yourself so you can be there for others. Have a dose every day. Do something. Make a checklist, a to-do list, and get your dopamine. Spend time with others and get your oxytocin. Go out and take a walk in the sunlight and get your serotonin, and exercise and get your endorphins. DOSE. Dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, and endorphins. Do. Get out in the sunlight. Do. Be with others. Get out in the sunlight and exercise. DOSE. Thank you for coming to this presentation. I hope you learned something. I enjoyed being here with you.
Thank you, Laura, so much for this. It was incredible. Thank you for all the work that you've put into this presentation, for all the work that you've done for your community, and for what you did for us right now. Everybody, this is there. I put in the chat the session evaluation form, so if you could take a minute